Hey, happy Wednesday morning, everyone, and welcome back. This is Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And, pardon me, we are examining the doctrine of the man of sin. I know people who live in fear of the man of sin. They live in fear that the abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, and all the horrors described in the dispensational paradigm are just right around the corner. But what we have to understand is that when Paul wrote about the man of sin, when Jesus spoke of the abomination of desolation and the great tribulation, he was speaking, and they were speaking, of first century events. And I know in my own personal life, it has been such a freedom-inducing reality to know that the man of sin, the abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, were all fulfilled in the first century. They all had to do with the end of the Old Covenant age of Israel. They have nothing to do with the end of the Christian age. They have nothing to do with the future. And one of the things that really helped me to understand this was to realize and to place 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 in its proper historical, chronological, not to mention theological context and framework. Now, it's important to see that Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 said, "This I say to you by the word of the Lord." Scholars are generally agreed that what Paul was saying here is that he was reminding the Thessalonians of what Jesus had said in his personal ministry. Now, there are some who claim that Paul was giving new revelation. I don't think that will work on a number of different levels. If it was new revelation, then it's strange, is it not, that what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 to 18, is exactly parallel with what Jesus said in Matthew 24, 29 to 34. Point by point, perfect parallelism. It is best to understand, and Kenneth Gentry makes the observation, citing other scholars, that most scholars acknowledge and agree that Paul, in his eschatological teaching in Thessalonians, Paul was in fact drawing from the Olivet Discourse. Well, look, the implications of this are astounding. I understand that my dispensational friends believe that Matthew 24 has nothing to do with AD 70. Well, that is simply wrong, and going to have a debate on that one of these days, probably in October. But be that as it may, it is easily demonstrated that the Olivet Discourse was in fact all of it about the end of the Old Covenant age that came to its climax in AD 70. All right. One of the ways that we establish that is obviously to look at the temporal indicators, both in Matthew as well as in Thessalonians. To look at the fact that Paul was writing and that Jesus was speaking to his contemporary audiences, speaking of things that they themselves would experience. Now look, if both Jesus and Paul were speaking and writing to people and telling them they would themselves experience those things, then we have no right today to say those people did not and would not experience those things. When we examine the direct, I'm talking thematic, motival, grammatical, and linguistic, not to mention temporal, perfect parallels between Matthew 24 and 25 and Thessalonians. It is absolutely incredible. And not only that, To go back to a statement I made a moment ago, when both Jesus and Paul make it very clear that they are speaking of and writing about first century realities that the first century audiences themselves would experience, then hermeneutically, we have no right whatsoever to jerk those events out of the first century and apply them to a day and a time that had no audience relevance to them whatsoever. You know, it's interesting to me that postmillennialists see some of the parallels and they make the application between 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and the Olivet Discourse, and they come to the conclusion, well, whatever 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is about, it must have referred to first century events. My good friend Gary DeMar adduces 9 parallels. I've got a list of them here in my hand. 9 parallels between the Olivet Discourse and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. In Thessalonians, Paul used a very distinctive Greek word, episynagoge. And in Matthew, Jesus spoke of those who would come saying that the Lord had already come. That's what Paul is addressing, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Matthew, Jesus speaks of the man of sin. Jesus speaks of the spirit of lawlessness that was at work. Paul speaks of the man of lawlessness that was already at work. Jesus spoke of the abomination of desolation. Paul spoke of the man of sin sitting in the temple of God. And Paul draws upon what Jesus had said, and he said, I've told you these things. Jesus spoke of false Christ. Paul speaks of false Christ. Jesus spoke of the elect. Paul speaks of the elect. You know, so here is my friend Gary DeMar saying, now look, and let me quote this, quote, when studied against the backdrop of Matthew 24, we conclude that same time period is being discussed, a period of time leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That is in his book, Last Days Madness, page 325. Well, I agree with that. The parallels are perfect. But wait a minute, ladies and gentlemen. In my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, I adduce over 20 direct parallels between the Olivet Discourse and Thessalonians. And not only that, I adduce several perfect parallels between 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 to 18, and Matthew 24, 29 to 34. And the irony of this is, my good friend Gary DeMar says Matthew 24, 29 to 34 is AD 70. And then he comes to 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18 and says, oh, well, no. That's a totally different coming of the Lord. Folks, that's totally inconsistent. There is no logic. There is no sound hermeneutic. There is no sound exegesis in that claim. If you're going to go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and deduce parallels with Matthew 24 and say, well, Matthew 24 is AD 70 in these constituent elements, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 has those same constituent elements in it, therefore 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 must be AD 70, then when you go to Matthew chapter 24 and you find those perfect constituent parallels between verses 29 to 34 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 to 18. Guess what? We are logically, thematically, temporally, hermeneutically, and exegetically bound to say 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 or 4, and by the way, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, as Gary DeMar says, was in AD 70. If you want to see the incredible, perfect parallels between the Olivet Discourse and Thessalonians, you need to get a copy of my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. Look, These parallels, I draw on scholarship from across the board. This is not something I've imagined. This is something that scholars agree with. But they fail to follow through with the parallels. Go to my website, eschatology.org or BibleProphecy.com. Order a copy of We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. Mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping, and that will save you $5. Thank you again for being with me for this morning's morning musings. And don't forget, Preterist Pilgrim Weekend coming up July 14th through the 16th, including a 2-day formal debate with myself and Dr. David Hester of Faulkner University. Folks, you don't want to miss this. And if you want to watch that debate and the seminar live, go to BibleProphecy.com. Just follow the links. PPW 2016. You can register to watch it free on your own computer. And it will be archived on your own computer. You can watch it as many times as you like. Don't miss this great opportunity. All right? Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you on the flip side with more about the man of sin, so join me there.